Of course, you've all heard the statement, publish or perish. And by introducing our very own journal for Aspire, we'll give more of you a chance not to perish, but to publish. And I hope you all enjoy the first edition, which is in your satchels. I would like to start off by thanking my friend Hans Evers, who's the most recent editor of Human Reproduction, who's given me his slides that I've modified for today's talk. And I'd like to start off by just reviewing medical publishing. The first medical publication that's been located was in 1665 in France, and about the same time also the transaction of the Royal Society in UK took place. The Italians weren't far behind, followed by the Germans, and then the Danish, and of course the Dutch. So these are the early publications of medical achievements. Initially, the first few publications were nothing more than doctors reporting their experience, which is also, although that's very useful, because as you know, the oral contraceptive pill went on the market about 1960, and within the first 3 years, there were reports of deep venous thrombosis and pulmonary embolus as case reports in pill takers, which alerted us to there's a problem. So, you know, those case reports were fairly reasonable. In 1850, the format changed to the TED structure, where the theory, the experiment, discussion were reported in medical journals, and for the last nearly 50 years, the IMRAD system has come in, and that is still the structure of most medical publications that are published today. And that's the introduction, materials and methods, or patients and methods, as we sometimes call it, the results and discussion. And this still is the structure that fertility and reproduction uses. Now, why do we publish journals? I guess we publish for our readers, and there are three types of readers. There are the grazers, who pick up the journal, go through, see what the titles are and the short summaries, just to know what's been published. Then there are the hunters. They're the ones who might be asked to do a presentation on clomiphene. So they would sit down and go through PubMed and look at the literature and read the latest articles on clomiphene and letrozole and give you a review using their hunted papers. And then there are the people who don't have a life. And they're the gorgers. They're the ones who read every journal cover to cover and don't do much else. So one has to think about what we're doing. And I guess when you're going to write a paper, there are two questions that you might ask yourself first of all. The first question is, well, so what? What's it going to mean if I do this research and come to a conclusion? And the second one, who cares? Is it going to be a topic that people are going to be interested in and take notice of? So having decided that you pass all those things and you're doing a research project, you want to write it up and you want to impress the referees, then I suggest that it's structured on 18 paragraphs. That's all you need to do is write 18 paragraphs. 3 of these would be introduction, and I'm going to go through all of these in more detail. The material and methods is a very important part, so that divides into 5 paragraphs. The results into 4 paragraphs, discussion to 5 paragraphs, and the conclusion is the final paragraph where you have to sum up everything and sell the product to the consumer. So what I'm going to do now is take you through each of these sections and try and give you examples. For example, the introduction, and it's recommended that in the very first sentence of the introduction, you pick up some of the words from the title, so it's obvious what you're actually going to be writing about, what your research was about. The second paragraph in the introduction should be, you should explain why are you doing this study. For example, you've often wondered whether letrozole or clomiphene were better. So you've done a randomised prospective study of 30,000 patients in each group, because that's what you'd need probably to get the results. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but you explain why you're doing the study. It's to compare, to work out whether letrozole or clomiphene should be the medication of first choice in oral ovulation induction. And then you have to write down what your motivation was, why you started, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. It helps to know you want to do it because there was confusion in your mind after hearing Professor Ledger speak and reading the PCO guidelines, whether you should use clomiphene or letrozole, and you can explain all that. The motivation can be manifold. It might be on something that's you want to have an evidence-based approach to something, so you've therefore done a review of the literature. You want to talk about the 5 different causes of some certain condition and work out which are the most relevant. Or you might have a viewpoint. You've been offended by somebody else's article that says IVF doctors are just service providers and not real doctors. Or you might have read something that prompted you to do the survey, a quotation that you agreed with and wanted to prove, or a quotation you did not agree with and you want to disprove. Again, you might have posed a question saying, you want to know what the best way to stimulate women with PCO is. You might have an argument where you want to maybe discuss a particular syndrome, that how you should diagnose it. It should always be, PCO should always be diagnosed on ultrasound and not on biochemical tests. Or you might think it's time that ovarian cord cleave is the first line of treatment for anovulation, and you think it's time to consider the priorities. Or you might have an interesting case report which brings you into an area that you want to look at a literature review and discuss things. And also maybe it's something where you think it's an important point not to miss it. It's an unusual situation, but the writer wants to draw attention to this particular syndrome and its symptoms so you don't miss it. Or you might write about something like 1 in 6 couples have subfertility, and therefore we should have a program to try and prevent this, or whatever you like. So the motivation could go into introduction. Having done those 3 paragraphs, you then move on to the most important part, or one of the most important parts, and that's the materials and methods. And that should be divided into 5 different paragraphs. The first of these, which I'll call paragraph 4 for our paper, is to describe your subjects. Talk about the study design, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria, obviously. We do have to get Institute Review Board approval for all papers before they can be published these days. And also you want to state the demographics of your patients, their age, their height, their weight if it's relevant, whether they've had children before, whatever. The next paragraph should be devoted to describing the procedures which were undertaken, the protocol you have used, the medication that you have prescribed, and also the equipment you might have used. And I must admit, certainly in the IVF papers, it gets a bit monotonous because everyone's using very similar things, but still there is to be a brief description of what was used. Sometimes you might think it's superfluous, but you should do it shortly anyway. The 6th paragraph should be the definition and criteria of what it is that you're looking at, define exactly who you've included, and if you're talking about various types of endometriosis, the different grading or ranking, the staging of the disease, and any other variables that might affect it. And then the 7th paragraph should be one that in which you describe how the data was collected, whether it's prospective, whether it was randomised, whether it was blinded, how it was validated, and whether it's been done by 10 different observers or the same observer did all the observations, to give detail about the collection of the data. And finally, the one that we all like is you must describe the statistics. And these are getting more and more complicated, but certainly you discuss the tests that you used, the sample size, and the power calculation that you performed before you started doing the study. And that kind of describes what you've done. I guess probably the most important thing, even more important than material method, is what you found, the results. And the results, again, take up 5 paragraphs in this structured approach. The subjects about finding what you found out about them, about how they changed their characteristics, what the demographics changed. The results, and in the results, what you should do is just give the numerical results the numbers and the percentages and not go into a commentary. That's for the discussion. You can put some of this data in figures or tables, but if you do that, please do not write it up again. Do not have it in there twice. Just refer to the tables and don't say in words what you've done in figures or tables. And then finally, the second last paragraph, the fourth paragraph in the results, the last paragraph is to correlate with how it came out with what you expected, compared to the gold standard. Is it statistically significant? And you might like to comment to various sizes of groups and so forth for the results. And then we move on to the discussion. And the discussion gets 5 paragraphs as well. First of all, you start off with a very brief sum. Do not repeat the results, but just very briefly summarise them as the answer to the question you posed in your introduction. You then need to interpret what these results mean, and particularly in context of literature. If you find that in your hands there's a much higher success rate for clomiphene and letrozole, then you need to say that it's how it's different from other studies. But do not make the mistake of doing another literature review here. You've already done some degree in your introduction. Don't repeat the literature review here. In the 4th paragraph in the discussion, we'd advise you to talk about how this can be applied clinically. How does it change treatment? Whether you recommend that all doctors start off treating PCO patients with letrozole rather than clomiphene, or whether you say there's no difference and therefore could be a clinician's choice. And if you've learned anything new in the pathophysiology from the study, which doesn't always happen, then again you should put that into the implications. And finally, in the discussion, always be somewhat self-reserved and do discuss the limitations, why the study wasn't perfect, what things might have made the results become not what they seem, and what the limits were, what's valid, and that your interpretations. And that's the finish of the discussion. So the next thing is we go to the conclusion. And in the conclusion, you've got to answer the question of so what. You need to, again, very briefly summarise your conclusions, emphasise the principal findings, and say why it's important. And if it's apparent, you say, well, I think on the Cochrane reports, there's a permanent line on template which says further studies are needed. And you might like to do the same new paper saying, although my study shows this, I still recommend further randomised studies are needed. That's always the safe thing to put on the end. So to summarise that, they're the 18 paragraphs that you should use. I think the slides will be available if you want to use this for a template. And the other thing I would like to do briefly is to tell you what not to do. There are a number of things which will irritate referees and editors, and what I recommend is if you want your paper published, then don't do the following things. First of all, don't read the instructions to authors. Do the paper in a totally different format. Don't follow the IMRAD, and that'll make sure that you won't get your paper published. Second thing is we don't actually have a maximum limit in F&R, but what you could do is be really verbose and keep repeating yourself and make it much longer than what you'd expect, because space is limited, and if you have a particularly long paper, you're less likely to get it published. Again, I guess you can write in a style where everything's ambiguous, and you want to make it so confusing that they can't understand it, and that's probably not advisable. Of course, the other thing some people do, and one of my colleagues I work with is excellent at this, every time you write a paper, you put your whole CV on the end in the references. Even if it doesn't actually have any relation to what you're writing about, it's always good to put yourself out in lights. So use all your old publications as a reference in the end. That'll also annoy the referees. And the other thing you can do, of course, is use the IMRAD structure, but muck up what you do. So have the discussion and the results, and have some of the results and discussion and don't follow the structure. They're all things that'll make sure that you don't get paper published. So, but what if you do want to have your paper published? Well, first of all, we're inviting you all to submit papers to our new journal. The first edition of that for this meeting, dated March. Next one will be dated June. And we've already got 3 accepted publications, but there's still room for some more. And if you get anything in the next 4 weeks or so, it can still make the second edition of our journal. And when you've submitted your papers, it's an editorial manager system, which is sort of self-run, and the website is there. If you go and just put in Fertility Reproduction, you will end up with that website. And when the paper is put in, the system sends me a notice. I'll look at the paper and I'll look at one of our 15 or so associate editors and try and find someone who's a bit of an expert in that field. I then appoint that person associate editor, who then accepts the appointment, and if he does, it is his role to find a couple of referees who are going to referee the paper and say, yes, it should be published, no, it needs some minor changes, it needs major changes, or no, it shouldn't be published. When the 2 blinded reports go back to the associate editor, then he makes a recommendation on one of those 4 lines. And if both the referees agree, it's easy. But if the referees have a different opinion, then it's up to the associate editor to make a decision, or he might decide, or she might decide, to send that paper out for a 3rd referee for adjudication. What happens then when the decision is made, it comes back to both the editor-in-chief, myself, but the editorial manager, the computerised system, sends out an automatic notification to the person who's the corresponding author. And I hope that these words of advice will be of some help to you, and I hope that you will send us lots of papers. Now, we've got a KPI. The KPI I've set for our journal is that in 20 years' time, the impact factor for F&R has to be higher than the current impact factor, or the impact factor at the time for human reproduction. So that's our challenge. It's a bit of a stretch target, but I'm reasonably confident that if I come back in 20 years' time, or I look down from you from above, I'll see that fertility and reproduction is highly successful. It caters to a lot of the people in the area of Aspire, because we have a very big population. As far as IVF cycles are concerned, I'm sure we shall exceed Europe by then, and I can see that our own journal in Asia Pacific will be very important and hopefully very successful. So I'm happy to answer any questions.